She came crawling out of the brush, wild and desperate, barefoot, half-clothed, only two large leaves pressed to her chest, held tight by arms that trembled as though they might snap under the weight of fear. Her knees were scraped raw, the flesh torn and bleeding. Dirt clung to her skin, the brown stains mixing with the red bruises blooming across her ribs, her shoulders, and her thighs. The sunburn on her back peeled in strips, and her face was a grimace of pain and exhaustion. She couldn't have been older than 20, but there was something in her eyes, something broken, that made her seem much older. Silas Reeve had seen many things in his 58 years. He'd lived through wars, plagues, and the deep, aching silence of losing men who never came home. But nothing in his long life had prepared him for the sight of that girl, stumbling through the fence line of his ranch like death itself had spit her out and left her to crawl. The bucket he had been carrying dropped from his hand, hitting the dry Texas soil with a heavy thud that echoed across the emptiness. The girl flinched, her eyes wide with fear, her body jerking back as if the ground might rise up to swallow her. She raised one shaking hand, a silent warning. "Don't come closer," she cried, her voice raw, like it had been torn from her throat and stitched together with terror. "I'll scream. I swear I will. I'll kill you if I have to." Her words didn't hold the strength of a threat, but the wild fear behind them was unmistakable. There was fight in her, a fire that hadn't yet been snuffed out. Silas didn't move. He stayed still, his hands raised slowly, showing her he meant no harm. "All right," he said quietly, keeping his voice low, soothing. "No one's gonna hurt you here." She looked at him then, not as a man, but as a thing to be feared, a predator, a shadow she had barely escaped. And then her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the ground in a heap of dust, bruises, and broken leaves. Silas stood there, watching her. He didn't rush to help her. He didn't know if she'd bite or scream. He knew nothing about this girl, but something in him, something deep inside, said to wait. Let her be. He walked to the porch, pulled off his coat, and laid it down a few feet away from her. Then, without a word, he sat down. Not too close, but not too far. The wind kicked up across the prairie, carrying the scent of dry grass and old secrets. Evelyn, he didn't know her name, but he thought it might be Evelyn, kept watching him, her eyes wide and unblinking, ready to flee or to fight. He said nothing, and neither did she. There they sat, two strangers on a ranch, the weight of 100 unspoken stories hanging between them. The only question that mattered right now was, who was this girl, and what kind of hell had she just crawled out of? The night came, thick and heavy, and Evelyn didn't speak. She curled up beneath the porch roof, her body shaking from cold and fear. The coat Silas had given her was the only thing holding her together. She wrapped herself tightly in it, like it was a lifeline, as if it might be the one thing that could keep her from falling apart completely. Silas didn't press her. He left her some water, a plate of beans, and a blanket that had once belonged to his wife. Then he went to bed, but he didn't sleep easy. His eyes stayed open, and his mind stayed sharp. The girl might be a danger, or she might be just like every other broken soul who wandered into this forsaken place. But one thing was certain. She wasn't just running from the wilderness. She was running from something much worse. The next morning, the sun crept over the horizon, and Silas found her still there. She hadn't moved, still clutching those damn leaves like they were her only protection. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were vacant, staring into a past only she knew. "You got a name?" Silas asked, his voice carrying across the distance, soft and unhurried. She didn't answer right away. There was a long pause, a silence, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Then, finally, in a voice so thin it was almost lost in the wind, she whispered, "Evelyn." He nodded. That was all. He didn't ask for more. She wasn't ready. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the same uneasy rhythm. Evelyn refused to come inside the cabin. She wouldn't eat unless Silas backed away from the table, allowing her to eat in peace, her eyes darting at every sound, every shadow that moved too quickly. She wouldn't sleep unless the lamp burned through the night, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Silas saw it all, the quiet, unspoken terror that gripped her every moment. It wasn't just the world that had broken her. It was men. It was something deeper, something darker. By the third day, she stepped inside the cabin, not far, just past the door. She stood there, still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the fireplace. Then they moved to something hanging on the wall, a worn leather collar, cracked and stained with something dark in the seams. Her face went pale. Her lips parted, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was recognition in her eyes. Recognition and fear. "You one of them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You kept women here like me?" Quote. Silas felt the weight of her words like a stone settling in his chest. He didn't look at the collar. He knew what it meant. "I used to ride security wagons," he said quietly. "They didn't tell us what was in the back. We were paid to keep our mouths shut, and I did." For too long. Evelyn's hands started to tremble again, her breathing quickening, but she didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at him, the space between them widening, the past pulling them further apart with every breath she took. That night, she didn't sleep under the porch. She slept in the barn, on the hay, like a stray dog that didn't trust the food in the bowl. Silas sat alone on the porch, turning a tin cup in his hands, thinking about all the times he'd looked away when he should have looked closer. And then, as the sun sank below the horizon, he heard the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't polite. It was a warning. The knock was barely a whisper on the wind, but it froze Silas in place. His hand brushed the revolver on his hip, something he hadn't touched in years. He hadn't needed it since the last time he buried a man who deserved it. But tonight felt different. He stood slowly, the weight of his years and regret pulling him down. But there was something in the air now, something that told him trouble was coming. At the gate, a figure stood, outlined by the fading light of the setting sun. A man, a stranger. But not just any stranger. This was a man whose face you didn't forget, not for the scar running down his chin like a mark of fate itself. His long coat fluttered in the evening breeze, his boots dusty from travel, and his eyes, cold and calculating, met Silas's as if they already knew each other's histories. Evelyn saw him from the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand dropped, the spoon she had been holding, the sound of it clanging sharply against the wooden floor. "That's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the one who locked the door behind me." Silas didn't flinch. He'd seen men like this before. He'd ridden with men like this. But not anymore. He stepped off the porch, his boots thudding softly on the dirt. The wind was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for what came next. "Evening, Jude," Silas said, his voice rough, familiar, like he had spoken that name 1,000 times. Jude didn't smile. His lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was something darker, something that said they knew each other too well, and no amount of time would change that. "Silas Reeve," Jude said, his voice low. "Still breathing, I see. You here for the girl?" "I'm here for what belongs to Mr. Clay," Jude replied, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. The silence stretched between them like a noose, tightening with every passing second. Silas didn't move, didn't blink. His hand rested on the revolver, but it stayed in its holster. He didn't need it yet. "You tell Ben Clay that Silas Reeve already buried enough men for one lifetime," Silas said, his voice calm but filled with an edge that told Jude this wasn't a man you could push easily. "He doesn't want me digging again." Jude's eyes flickered, just for a moment. A brief hesitation, but it was enough. Silas saw it, the flicker of doubt, the uncertainty. Jude wasn't so sure anymore that Silas was the old man he used to be. Jude tipped his hat, the movement smooth, calculated. Without another word, he turned his horse around and rode off, his spurs clicking softly in the quiet evening air. Silas watched him leave, his heart heavy with the weight of old sins. He didn't need to draw his gun. Not this time. Evelyn didn't move. She stayed in the corner of the kitchen, her body stiff, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She didn't breathe too loudly. She was a ghost in the shadows, watching, waiting for the storm to come. That night, Silas sat on the porch again, his tin cup resting in his hands, his thoughts running over the same old ground. The knock hadn't been a threat. It had been a test, a way for Clay to know if Silas was still in this fight. And now, he knew. Clay knew where Evelyn was, and that was only the beginning. The past wasn't done with Silas yet. And Evelyn? She was running out of time. The night stretched on, long and heavy. The stars twinkled above, distant and cold. But down here, in the quiet of the ranch, there was a tension in the air, thick as smoke, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Evelyn didn't come out from the kitchen. She didn't speak to him. She was like a shadow, hiding in the corners of the house, afraid to come closer. Silas didn't press her. Not yet. He knew better. She would speak when she was ready, and not a second sooner. The next day, Silas went about his usual work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that knock, to Jude, to the man who had sent him. Ben Clay. A name that once meant power and fear, but now just felt like an old wound that wouldn't heal. Around midday, Evelyn stepped out of the cabin, her feet light on the dry earth. She didn't come near him, just stood a few feet away, watching him work, her eyes still cautious. She hadn't spoken much in the last few days, but Silas saw something in her now. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was curiosity, and maybe even a little bit of trust. "You should eat," Silas said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but it carried. "There's food in the cabin." She hesitated, then nodded. She didn't say anything, but she turned and walked slowly toward the cabin. Silas watched her go. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. That this girl, this broken, haunted girl, was something more than just a stranger who'd stumbled onto his ranch. She was a shadow of the past, yes. But maybe, just maybe, she could be the answer to something more. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Silas sat on the porch, staring out at the vast emptiness around him. He had buried enough men. He had made enough choices. But this time, he wasn't sure he could just walk away. Because sometimes, when the past comes calling, a man has to pick a side. And Silas was about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. A medium outdoor shot shows two people, a woman and a man, standing in a dry, grassy field on a sunny day. In the center-left foreground is a young adult woman with long, dark brown hair that is wet and messy, framing her face. She has light skin and appears to be mostly nude, covering her chest and midriff with two very large, bright green, heart-shaped leaves, possibly from an elephant ear plant. Her expression is one of distress, with wide, worried eyes and an open mouth. There is what appears to be dirt or blood smudges on her arms, legs, and face. To the right of the woman is a middle-aged to older adult man, with light, tanned skin, grayish hair, and a serious, stoic expression. He is dressed in a light-colored, long-sleeved button-up shirt and tan pants, typical of Western wear. He is wearing a light-colored cowboy hat. Behind and slightly between them is a brown horse, saddled and standing still. The background depicts a dry, open landscape typical of a ranch or prairie setting under a bright sky. A wooden fence runs horizontally across the middle ground. In the far background to the left, there are some rudimentary wooden structures, suggesting a farm or ranch. The ground is dry earth and sparse, yellowish grass. The sunlight is harsh and bright, casting minimal shadows. The overall scene suggests a dramatic or tense moment in a western or rural setting. The days blurred together, moving like the dusty winds that swept across the prairie. The air felt thick with the weight of what was yet to come. Even the sky seemed heavy, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that Silas knew was coming. But the storm wasn't just in the air. It was in his bones, in the silence that stretched between him and Evelyn. They didn't talk much. Not about the past, not about the men who had come for her, and certainly not about the badge. There were no more questions about who she was or where she had come from. Silas had made his choice. He'd chosen her. And now they were both stuck in the quiet between decisions, just waiting for the world to catch up. Evelyn spent most of her time outside now, wandering the fields, avoiding the cabin like it was a cage she couldn't quite trust. She was still jumpy, still quick to retreat, but every now and then, Silas saw a flicker of something else, something softer, something human, behind her eyes. She was starting to live again, even if she wasn't quite ready to admit it. Silas, for his part, kept busy with the ranch, but his mind was always elsewhere, lingering on the future he couldn't quite see. He was a man who had buried more than just his past. He had buried his conscience, his hopes, and everything that once made him feel like a man worth respecting. But now, with Evelyn on his land, things were changing. And Silas couldn't decide if that was a blessing or a curse. One morning, as the sun rose high and the land shimmered with the heat of the day, Silas found himself on the porch, leaning against the post, watching Evelyn. She was out by the barn, her hands working quickly as she brushed down the horses, the motions almost mechanical, like she was trying to bury herself in the work. Silas didn't move, just watched her for a while, knowing there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do to make her feel safe. Not yet. Then, unexpectedly, she turned toward him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, heavy with all the unspoken things they'd left behind. And in that silence, something shifted. She walked toward him, slowly, hesitating just a step away. Her eyes were guarded, but there was something in them, something different. She was no longer a girl lost in the wild. She was something else now, something Silas didn't have a name for. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "You didn't have to. You didn't owe me anything." Silas shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before looking back at her. "I didn't have to," he said quietly. "But I reckon I couldn't stand by and let you die. Not when I've buried enough folks for 100 lifetimes." Evelyn's lips pressed together, and for a moment she didn't speak. She just looked at him, as if trying to make sense of the man who had taken her in without asking for anything in return. But that was the thing with Silas. He didn't ask for much. He didn't expect anything. Not from her, not from the world. "Do you think I'll ever be free of them?" she asked after a long pause. "The men who—" She trailed off, the words choking her as if saying them aloud might bring them back. "Do you think I'll ever stop running?" Silas's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that it would all be fine, that the world could change, and that she could heal. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that sometimes you ran until there was nowhere left to go. And sometimes the past came for you, no matter how hard you tried to outrun it. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low, "but I'll be here as long as you need me." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that she would never let fall. She didn't speak again, but she took a step closer to him. And that small movement, that tiny shift, was enough for Silas to feel the change. Later that night, Silas found himself sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the land that stretched endlessly before him. His tin cup sat beside him, untouched. The sky was deep with stars, and the wind carried the scent of earth and dust, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he still had to protect. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him and didn't need to turn around to know it was Evelyn. She stood there for a moment, her presence a quiet comfort in the dark. Then, without a word, she sat down beside him. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two people sitting together, letting the weight of the world pass over them, as it always did, until the morning came again. "I'm not leaving," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "I don't know where I'm going, but I'm not running anymore." Silas looked at her then, his eyes steady, unflinching. "You don't have to run. Not here. Not with me." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Evelyn let out a breath, a sound that might have been relief, might have been acceptance. She didn't smile, but Silas could see it. the smallest crack in the armor she had built around herself. They sat there for a while longer, watching the stars fade as the night gave way to the first light of dawn. The air was cooler now, the stillness of the early morning settling over them like a blanket. Evelyn's voice broke through the quiet once more, this time with a different question, one that had been gnawing at her for days. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "After all this, when we've dealt with the past?" Silas thought for a moment. His heart still carried the weight of things he couldn't change, things that would haunt him until the day he died. But there was something different about the question, something that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. "I think about it every damn day," he said, his voice low but certain. "And when the time comes, we'll face it together." For the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't look away. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, Silas saw something in her eyes that wasn't just fear, it was hope. And that, in a world like theirs, was a rare thing. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Silas felt the change in the air. It was subtle at first, a shift in the wind, a stillness in the morning that spoke of something far more dangerous than the usual Texas heat, the kind of quiet that told him trouble was near. He didn't need to see it. He could feel it in his bones, in the deep, gnawing ache that had never quite left him. Evelyn was already up, standing by the fence, her face turned to the early light, her hands resting on the wooden slats. Silas watched her for a moment before walking toward her. He hadn't seen her this still in days, and it made something in his chest tighten. She was no longer the girl who had crawled out of the brush in fear and desperation. She was something more now, a woman with the courage to face what came next, even if it still terrified her. "You feel it too?" he asked, his voice low, as he stopped beside her. Evelyn nodded, not looking at him, but at the empty stretch of land before them. The vastness of it seemed to swallow the sound of her breath. She had stopped running, but that didn't mean the past wouldn't catch up. And Silas knew it. He saw it in the way she gripped the fence, her fingers digging into the wood like she could hold the world back with nothing but her will. "They'll come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Won't they?" Silas didn't answer right away. What could he say? That she was wrong? That somehow, by some miracle, her past wouldn't find its way to her? He had been running from his own ghosts for years. He knew better than to lie. "They'll come," he said quietly, his gaze moving over the horizon. "And when they do, we'll deal with it together." Evelyn's hands tightened on the fence, and Silas could see the muscles in her jaw tense. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was prepared. And that was something Silas hadn't seen in her until now. There was a fire in her, a determination that matched his own. For the rest of the day they worked side by side, the air heavy with the knowledge that their time was running out. The ranch, once a place of solitude and quiet, now felt like a ticking clock. Every sound, every movement, a reminder that something was coming. Silas worked in silence, but his mind never left the thought of what would happen when the men came. He wasn't afraid, but he was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of running. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Silas and Evelyn were finishing up the last of the work on the barn. It was just the two of them now, no one else to depend on, no one else to help. The wind had picked up again, this time carrying the scent of dust and smoke. And then came the sound. The unmistakable sound of hooves. It was too late to run. They both knew it. Silas walked to the edge of the porch, his boots kicking up dust with every step. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He'd faced this moment 100 times before, but never with a woman by his side, never with something to protect. "They're here," he muttered, his voice hard as stone. Evelyn came up beside him, standing tall and strong, though her hands shook ever so slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The two of them stood there, facing the oncoming riders, knowing what was coming next. The men rode up, slow and steady, like they had all the time in the world. Silas recognized them immediately. They were the same men who had come before, the same men who had given him the warning. But now, they weren't just testing him. They were here to finish what they'd started. The man with the scar on his chin, Jude, was in the lead. He didn't even look at Silas at first. His eyes were locked on Evelyn, his expression cold and unfeeling, like he was already deciding what he would do with her. "You're coming with us," Jude said, his voice sharp and demanding. "Ben Clay's orders." Silas stepped forward, his hand hovering over his revolver, but again he didn't draw it. He didn't need to. This time it was different. "I told you before," Silas said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. "You don't come for her. Not unless you want to make a grave mistake." Quote. Jude's eyes flicked to Silas, a brief flash of hesitation crossing his face. But only for a second. Then he smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You're really gonna make me do this, old man?" Jude taunted. "You're really gonna die for her?" Silas didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. He had buried enough men in his lifetime to know when a fight was over before it started. "Not for her," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "For me. For everything I should have done but didn't." Jude's smile faded, and for the first time, Silas saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But that doubt was quickly replaced with anger. Jude motioned to the men behind him, and they moved in, surrounding Silas and Evelyn. "Take her," Jude said. "We'll take her, and we'll deal with you after." But Silas didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stepped between them, his eyes locked on Jude's. "You'll have to kill me first," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Evelyn's hand moved, just a fraction, but it was enough. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Silas's sleeve. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. The standoff hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse, waiting for the smallest spark to set it off. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying the scent of dust and danger. And then, in a flash, the tension broke. Evelyn stepped forward, her body shaking but her eyes hard with determination. "I'm not yours to take any more," she said, her voice rising. "You don't get to decide." Jude's eyes widened. For the first time, the weight of her words hit him. "I'm done running," Evelyn said, her gaze never leaving him. The men hesitated, the silence stretching between them. The storm wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, Evelyn wasn't afraid. And that made all the difference. The air between them crackled with tension, a storm waiting to break. Silas could feel it in his chest, the weight of what came next, settling over him like a thick blanket. The men stood still, unsure, as if Evelyn's words had thrown them off balance. They weren't prepared for this. They thought they knew fear, but they hadn't seen this. Jude's eyes flickered, a silent recognition of what he was up against. But he wasn't backing down. Not yet. Not when Ben Clay was counting on him. "All right, girl," Jude finally said, his voice tight with rage. "You've got spirit, but it won't save you. We've got orders." Evelyn's hand stayed steady at her side. Silas could see her jaw set firm, the fire in her eyes brighter than he had ever seen it. She wasn't the broken girl who had stumbled onto his land anymore. She was someone else now, someone who had found the courage to fight. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Evelyn said, her voice a quiet but powerful declaration. "And you can't make me." Jude's gaze turned cold, calculating. He looked at his men, his lip curling into a sneer, and then he turned back to Silas. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You've got nothing left." Quote. Silas's hand hovered over the handle of his revolver. He knew the weight of what was coming, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not when it was clear that the past had finally caught up to him, and this was the moment when he would face it, once and for all. "I've got everything I need," Silas said quietly, his voice strong. "And you're not taking her." The men circled them, closing in like wolves, their eyes never leaving Silas or Evelyn. The standoff stretched, a heartbeat in the space between them, and then, before anyone could make a move, the sound of hooves filled the air. It wasn't just the men Jude had brought. Silas knew that sound. He knew the rhythm of those hooves, and in that moment, a voice in his gut told him that they weren't alone anymore. "Jude!" A voice called from behind them, a deep, gruff voice that carried across the yard. "That's enough." The riders stopped dead in their tracks. Jude turned sharply, his face paling slightly as he recognized the voice. A man on horseback appeared from the horizon, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. A tall figure, cloaked in a long duster, with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. As the rider came closer, the dust of the road billowed around him, and Silas saw the man clearly. Ben Clay! Jude's face twisted in a mix of surprise and unease. The other men shifted uneasily in place, glancing back at their leader, unsure of what to do. Ben Clay's arrival had changed everything. "You sure you want to do this, Jude?" Ben Clay called out, his voice calm, almost mocking. "Because I'm not here for a fight." Jude's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Silas could see the man wrestle with the order he had been given. But Ben Clay's presence loomed large, and it was clear that the power dynamics were shifting. Jude turned back to Silas, his eyes hard with the weight of 1,000 decisions. "I told you," Jude muttered, his voice low. "We'll take the girl." Ben Clay's voice rang out again, cutting through the tension. "I said no, Jude. She stays." The words hung in the air like a lightning strike. Silas didn't move, neither did Evelyn. It was as if the world had stopped, the quiet of the moment settling around them like the calm before a storm. Jude's shoulders slumped in defeat. The men behind him shifted uncomfortably, and one by one, they began to pull back. Ben Clay's authority was undeniable. Jude had no choice but to obey. "You're letting her go?" Jude growled, still struggling to understand. Ben Clay nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "She's not yours anymore. She never was." Jude stood frozen for a moment longer, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Then, with a sharp jerk, he turned his horse and rode off, his men following without another word. The sound of their hooves faded into the distance, and the tension in the air finally began to ease. Evelyn didn't move. She stayed where she was, her eyes locked on the horizon, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Silas stood beside her, watching as the last of the riders disappeared from view. Ben Clay dismounted, his boots landing softly on the dry earth. He stood for a moment, eyeing Silas with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You should have never gotten involved," Ben said, his voice low but steady. "This could have gone a lot worse for you." Quote, Silas didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ben Clay already knew the truth. The past wasn't done with him. But for now, Silas had done what he could, and that was enough. Ben Clay looked over at Evelyn, his eyes softening for just a moment. "You're free now," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Go, live." Evelyn didn't speak, but Silas saw her shoulders relax, the weight she had been carrying finally starting to lift. It wasn't over. The scars wouldn't fade. But she was free, in a way she hadn't been before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Silas and Evelyn stood together in the quiet of the ranch, the world around them beginning to settle. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was no longer filled with fear. It was just two people, finally able to breathe again. And maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth holding on to. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.